married my boyfriend's older brother thinking I could hide the affair, but he exposed me. If I'd known how quickly one mistake could destroy everything I'd built, I would have shut the door that afternoon and never looked back. But I didn't. I let curiosity and old feelings win, and now all that's left of my life is the wreckage I created with my own hands. I grew up poor, like really poor. The kind of poor where birthdays meant secondhand gifts and new clothes were always just hand-me-downs from siblings. My parents tried their best, but their best could only stretch so far when there were mouths to feed and bills that never stopped coming. We scraped by, but always just barely. And because of that, I missed out on a lot. So when I met my husband, Benjamin, it felt like I'd finally stepped into the life I'd always watched from the outside. He spoiled me from the very beginning. After we started dating, my life was suddenly full of nice dinners and surprise gifts, things I'd only ever daydreamed of. I remember crying the first time he bought me a dress that cost more than my entire monthly salary at the time. And I remember the way he laughed and told me to get used to it. And I did. Slowly at first. The expensive dinners, the weekend trips, the drivers waiting outside. At first, I felt like an imposter in that world, like someone would come tap me on the shoulder and tell me to go back where I belonged. But that never happened. And eventually I stopped worrying each time I swiped one of his cards. I stopped checking price tags, and I learned what wines went with different meals. I got used to designers, and after a few months of being with him, I even quit my job at his request. The fear of losing and missing out on things was replaced by a hunger to have more. I didn't just get used to it, I went overboard. It's strange how quickly enough stops being enough when you have the money to burn. At first, it was just buying little things to fill the silence and entertain me when Benjamin was away on business trips. Then came the bigger, more expensive things. There was jewelry I didn't need and clothes I never wore. The house began to fill with boxes and piles of things that gave me a brief rush when they arrived and nothing afterward. It was boring and lonely being a housewife. Benjamin worked long hours and traveled often, and I had no real purpose beyond keeping up appearances and managing the house. So I shopped. Shopping became my way of relaxing and feeling in control. I used his money to impress the other wives in our neighborhood, the ones who could tell I hadn't been born into wealth like them. I knew they would never see me as one of them, and that impressing them was pointless, but that didn't stop me from trying. Benjamin didn't say much at first. I think he was amused in the beginning. He'd smile and shake his head when new boxes arrived, or when I mentioned redecorating again. But eventually, all the arguably useless things I'd filled the house with started to bother him. He finally said something the day he opened a bank statement and saw just how deep I'd sunk into his credit cards. He wasn't angry, really, just a bit disappointed, which somehow felt worse. He told me he understood that I hadn't grown up with much, and maybe I was now overcompensating for it, but that it had to stop. His voice was calm and gentle when he asked me to take it easy. And of course, I agreed immediately. I promised to be better and limit my excessive spending, and I meant it too, or at least I wanted to mean it. But it turned out to be harder than I expected. I'd spent years being able to get whatever I wanted with a few taps on my phone or the swipe of a card. Quitting so abruptly was difficult. And it was quiet. I didn't know what to do with myself without the little thrill of buying something new. Eventually, I convinced myself that as long as I was careful, I could still get what I wanted and no one had to know. So foolishly, I opened a new credit card in Benjamin's name. I told myself it wasn't really lying or stealing since the money was mine too anyway, and I thought that I'd eventually be able to pay it off in a few months anyway. But the whole thing fell apart in a matter of weeks. It didn't take long before Benjamin found out. He came home later than usual that night, looking more exhausted than usual. He found me making dinner in the kitchen, and he pulled out his phone, swiped for a bit, and then set it down in front of me. The screen glowed with rows of numbers, transactions, and dates, all under the new card I'd opened. My stomach dropped. He didn't raise his voice when he said, "You want to tell me what this is?" I froze. I didn't know what to say. After a while of saying nothing, the words started to rush out of me. I tried to deny it in a casual way and blame it all on some kind of mix-up, but I was barely making any sense and my words were all tangled up. Eventually, Ben cut through my stammering. He told me not to insult his intelligence. He said his accountant had flagged the new account days ago, and that he'd been hoping, stupidly maybe, that it wasn't me. I was really hoping, he said, that you weren't foolish enough to think I wouldn't find out. Something in the way he said it stung more than the accusation itself. It felt like I was being scolded like a child. Then before I could respond, he just looked at me with this tired, hurt expression and asked me why. Why I felt the need to go behind his back like that. And I didn't have an answer. Because how could I explain that money had become a crutch for me? How could I tell someone who had given me everything that it still didn't feel like enough? I wanted to explain. I wanted to defend myself and claw back some dignity, but I didn't know how or what to say. So I did what I always did when I was cornered, and I deflected. I told him it wasn't fair that he'd promised me a life where I'd never have to worry about money again, just to try and take it away now. I said that after everything I'd been through and growing up with nothing, it was cruel for him to suddenly cut me off now. He just stared at me for a moment like he couldn't make sense of what I was saying or me. Then he said, "This isn't about what you've been through or what I promised. And I didn't cut you off. I just asked you to slow down and to be a little more careful." He shook his head and his voice got sharp. "But you couldn't do that, could you? You were too greedy to stop." The word snapped something in me, and that was when I got really angry. "Greedy?" I said, my voice rising. "Like I'm some parasite leeching off you and not your wife? You're the greedy one, Ben. You're selfish and out of touch." Pretty soon I was yelling at him even though I didn't want to. I didn't want to fight, but I couldn't help the way the words poured out of me. "You have more money than you know what to do with, and you barely even notice when some of it goes missing. So why does it suddenly matter now if I buy a few handbags or a stupid sculpture? It's not like I'm wasting money we don't have." By the time I was done, my chest was heaving like I'd run laps or something. That was when his calm cracked and he started yelling too. "It's not about the fucking handbags," he shot back. "It's about you and your need to buy things just because you can. You're the selfish one. It's like you don't even care about me or our son. All you do is fill the house with meaningless bullshit and act like you're the victim." I responded by telling him he was being dramatic and that he was twisting everything, but he didn't let me finish. He said he was tired of coming home to a wife who only seemed happy when there was a new delivery waiting by the door, and that now he could barely tell the difference between me and the vapid wives in the neighborhood. Every word landed heavy and too close to the truth to argue with, but I tried anyway. I told him he had no idea what it was like for me to spend my days alone in the house, surrounded by walls he paid for, but barely lived inside. And I told him that he couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to be treated like an accessory. We went back and forth like that for what felt like hours, both of us saying things that couldn't be unsaid and that we didn't really mean. The fight only stopped because he'd gotten so angry that he told me that if I ever did it again, opened another account or used his name for anything without telling him, he'd press charges. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. I just stared at him, waiting for him to take it back or realize what he'd said, how he'd gone too far, and apologize. But he didn't. He turned away instead, and he just walked away like he couldn't stand to look at me anymore. I couldn't believe it. Press charges against me, his wife, the same man who once told me he'd give me the world had looked at me like I was a stranger who'd stolen something from him. My chest ached, and I didn't know what to do with the anger and pain that I felt. That night, I didn't go to our room. I couldn't. I went to our son's room instead, and I laid beside him. I couldn't sleep, so I just stared at the ceiling. I thought about the way he'd looked at me, like he was finally seeing me clearly and didn't like what he saw. I thought about how much I'd wanted this life and all that I'd given up to have it. I didn't cry, not then. I just lay there, listening to my son sleeping, waiting for morning to come, and hoping that Benjamin would be waiting for me with a kiss and an apology. But my hopes did not come to be. By morning, Benjamin was still angry, and the house had never felt so quiet. It was heavy and upsetting. He barely spoke to me when I saw him in the kitchen or even for the rest of the day. He answered questions when he had to, but his words were cold and his tone had no warmth. It hurt to see him like that, and it hurt even more to know that he was like that because of me, because I had betrayed his trust. So, in the days that followed, I tried to fix what I'd done. I tried to stop shopping altogether. I even stopped browsing my usual websites. Everything that I bought was either for our son or for the house. I made sure the bills were paid early, and I tried to cook his favorite meals and keep the house clean. I became a model housewife because I thought that if I could just prove that I'd learned my lesson, things might start to get better. But nothing changed. Nothing I did seemed to appease him. It was like he just didn't want to be around me. He would come home late, work in his study, barely touch the dinner I made, and then go to bed. It was like I didn't exist, and I couldn't believe what I'd done had really made him that upset. For a while, I told myself he just needed time, but after a few weeks, my remorse started to shift into something else. I couldn't understand why he was still treating me like a criminal when I'd done everything to make it right. It started to eat at me, all the silence and the distance. I went from feeling angry to feeling sad to feeling irritated all the time. My feelings were all over the place, and it was made even worse by Benjamin's continued silence and disappointment in me. It had been weeks since the fight, and he was still cold toward me. It was to the point where I wasn't sure when or if we ever would start talking to each other freely like we used to. But then one morning things changed. He started talking to me unprompted, and I allowed myself for a second to believe that maybe it was a step in the right direction, but I was wrong. It was the step that ruined our lives. That morning, he'd finished his breakfast, and I was about to leave so I could go get our son ready for school, but then he called me back. He asked if I was okay, and that he's sorry for not checking in a while. I told him that I was okay, and that I hadn't exactly been checking up too. After that, I'd thought the apology was imminent. I could barely contain my smile. I was so sure it was his way of reaching out and trying to fix things. And for the briefest moment, I felt light again, thinking that maybe that was the moment he'd forgive me and apologize for letting things drag on for so long. But it wasn't. Instead, he told me that his younger brother, Owen, was coming to stay with us for a while. He didn't say for how long, only that it would be indefinite. I blinked at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Then, as if to really twist the knife, he added that he didn't technically have to tell me ahead of time, seeing as it was his house. But he figured it was polite to give me a heads up since he knew that Owen and I didn't have the best relationship. Before I could respond, he went on to say that maybe some time together would be good for us, that perhaps Owen's presence would help finally ease the tension, and that it was time to put all the drama behind us. I didn't say a word. I couldn't really. My body felt frozen, and I think my brain couldn't decide between laughing or screaming. It had been nearly 10 years since I'd last seen Owen. 10 years since I destroyed him and myself, in a way. Benjamin's voice kept going. He was going on about cleaning up the guest room and how Owen could teach our son how to play an instrument, but the words were just noise in the background. I wasn't listening. I could barely hear him over the loud pounding in my chest. In that moment, I felt an insane urge to just walk out of the kitchen and keep walking until I was out of the house, down the street, and then God knows where. I even imagined never coming back. That seemed like a better option than facing Owen again. But before I could say anything or actually decide to run away, there was a knock at the door. I didn't move, and I stayed silent. Benjamin gave me a look like he knew I was acting weird but didn't know why before he got up and went to answer it. When he opened the door, there he was. Owen, with 2 duffel bags at his feet and the same easy smile on his face, older now, but unmistakably him. My throat tightened like there was an actual knot in it as I stood there, watching as Benjamin clapped his brother on the back and ushered him inside like nothing was wrong, like it wasn't the cruelest twist of fate that he was in our house. For Benjamin to say that Owen and I didn't have the best relationship was the understatement of the century, when just years back we'd had the best relationship and the worst ending imaginable. Almost 10 years earlier, Owen had been the first man I could say I truly loved. We met in college, and he was everything I thought I wanted back then. Funny and interesting, easygoing and a bit reckless. He made the world feel lighter, and he made me feel special. For a long time, we were inseparable. We moved in together after graduation. We had all these dreams and hopes for what our life would be like. We were naive and a little too optimistic, but we soon found out that life after college wasn't kind. The jobs we found barely paid enough to cover rent, and even then, some months we had to choose between bills and groceries. The weight of it wore us down. We started fighting over small things like the dishes, laundry, and who was trying harder or contributing more. Each argument slowly chipped away what we'd built. Still, we tried to hold on and keep it together. We told ourselves love was enough. But then Owen got fired. I'll never forget the night he came home with this look in his eyes, like he was ashamed and angry at the same time. He told me that he'd figure it out and that he'd find something soon. But then weeks turned into months, and he still hadn't gotten a job. The bills kept coming, the tension kept growing, and somewhere in the middle of all that, Benjamin came back into town. His startup had just started getting investors. He wasn't crazy rich yet or anything, but he was stable, and it seemed like things were only going to get better for him. When Owen introduced us, I didn't think much of it. Benjamin was polite and easy to talk to. He started dropping by our apartment sometimes to help Owen with resumes or just check in. I noticed the difference between them almost immediately, like how Benjamin's world seemed so much bigger and steadier, while Owen, and by extension mine, seemed so chaotic and uncertain, or how he never seemed worried about the things that kept me awake at night. Being with Owen became harder. I loved him, I really did, but love didn't pay rent or put food on the table. I didn't want to live like my parents had, constantly scrambling to make ends meet. I wanted security. I wanted something stable and permanent. So when the opportunity came and it seemed like Benjamin was interested in me and was willing to give me a better life, I took it. I told Benjamin that it wasn't all that serious between me and Owen, even though we'd been together for years, and when Benjamin eventually asked me out, I said yes. We dated for weeks, and the whole time Benjamin thought that I had broken up with Owen, but I hadn't. I was hiding things from both of them. When I actually broke up with Owen, it was when he was out of town for a job interview. I told him that I couldn't keep living the way we were, and that I was just doing what was best for me. Owen was devastated. He called for weeks after, begging me to come back, promising he'd make things work and find a good job. But by then, I'd already had a taste of what life could look like with Benjamin, and I knew I couldn't go back. When Benjamin and I got engaged, Owen stopped calling and stopped speaking to the two of us. He couldn't stand to see us together. I heard later from his mom that he'd moved away to start fresh somewhere else. So I tried not to think about him after that. I told myself it was for the best, and that I'd made the right choice. And for a while, for nearly a decade even, I believed it. But standing there, watching him step into my house and look at me, I wasn't sure what to believe. He smiled at me like we didn't have years of history and bad blood, like we were friends, and it took the weight out of my lungs. I stayed quiet as I watched Benjamin take his bag and ask if he wanted coffee. I walked a few paces behind them, quiet as a ghost, as Benjamin gave him a small tour of the house. If either of them noticed that I was acting strange, they didn't say. They just kept smiling and hugging and catching up while I was hanging behind, trying my best not to throw up at the sight of him again. Eventually, Benjamin disappeared upstairs, leaving the two of us standing in silence. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't even sure what I was feeling. But deep down, under the layers of resentment and guilt and confusion, I could already sense the start of something dangerous and inevitable. For the first few days after Owen arrived, the house felt smaller than it ever had before. I kept seeing him and bumping into him. It didn't make any sense considering how huge the house was, but I just couldn't escape him, so I started finding reasons to stay away from the house. I'd run errands I didn't need to run, and make plans with the women from the neighborhood that I never really wanted to see. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to be reminded of everything I'd buried years ago. Not the laughter, the fights, or the way he used to look at me like I was the only person in the world. None of it. But avoiding him wasn't easy. Sometimes I'd feel his eyes on me when I passed through the living room, or I'd even catch him staring in the kitchen. It wasn't always obvious, but I could feel it. It was like heat brushing against my skin, and I hated that after everything, he could still make me feel anything at all. Benjamin, for his part, seemed oblivious to it all. He came and went like usual. He was solely focused on work, like he always was, and he continued to keep conversations with me to the bare minimum. If he noticed the tension that filled the house and the growing heat between Owen and I, he didn't mention it. Then came the night that restarted it all. I had forgotten that Benjamin would be sleeping at his parents' house and taking our son with him for the night. He mentioned it in passing days before, but I hadn't paid much attention because my mind was too clouded by everything else. When I came home from dinner with a friend and saw only one car in the driveway, it hit me that I was alone with Owen for the night. He came in just past midnight, and I could tell from the lingering scent of alcohol that he'd been at a bar. I was curled up on the couch watching an old show. Coincidentally, it happened to be one we used to watch together way back when. I hadn't planned it or anything. In fact, I was only half watching and half listening when I heard him come in. "Didn't know you were still up," he muttered as he walked toward the couch. I didn't answer. I thought if I stayed silent long enough, he'd just go upstairs. Instead, he came to sit beside me. Still, I said nothing. I wanted to avoid interacting with him as much as possible. So we watched in silence, and after a while of us sitting there together, it started to feel like when we were younger. I didn't let myself get too lost in the nostalgia, though. When the episode ended, I grabbed the remote and switched off the TV. I stood quickly, desperate to escape before things could become something they shouldn't. But as I turned to leave, his hand closed around my wrist. "You don't have to be afraid of me, you know," he said softly. "I'm not afraid," I managed, though even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. It was the first thing aside from empty pleasantries I'd said to him since he'd moved in, and in so many years, really. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Sure you're not." Then, quieter, he said, "I'm not here to ruin your perfect little marriage, if that's what you think." His words stung in a way I didn't expect. Maybe because there was truth in them. I had been scared he was there to spoil things in some way. I looked down, trying to find something to say, but my thoughts were a blur. The only thing I could focus on was the warmth of his fingers against my skin and the way my heart was beating fast. He stood up and stepped closer without dropping my hand. "I'm not angry with you, not anymore. I get it." I wasn't sure what he meant by him getting it, but I couldn't ask. I didn't know how I would even begin to frame the words, and I wasn't sure I even wanted the answer anyway. He studied my face for a bit, and for a while we were staring at each other. A part of me couldn't believe that I was staring into his eyes again after so many years. I also couldn't believe it when he eventually reached up and cupped my cheek. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I couldn't help the way I leaned into it and practically rubbed my face against his palm like a cat. "You're even more beautiful than before," he said quietly. "Wealth suits you." That was the last thing he said before he pulled back and walked away. I stood there frozen in place with my head spinning in different directions. My heart was hammering like I'd just done something wrong. And maybe I had. Because that night was the beginning of the end for all of us. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face or heard his voice. I was plagued by him and his words. Part of me wanted to be angry that he thought he could just waltz into my life and start giving me compliments like I wasn't married to his brother, but a bigger part of me was just flustered because he'd called me beautiful. It was pathetic. For days, I tried to bury what happened and the confusing way I felt about it. I told myself it didn't mean anything and that maybe he was just being kind or he was just a little drunk. But it stayed with me. Every time we looked at each other or passed each other in the house, I remembered that night, and it felt like something unsaid hung between us. Then, one night, I couldn't sleep again. The house was too quiet, and things with Benjamin still weren't great. I was just very restless. So I went downstairs to get a glass of water. When I reached the kitchen, though, the light was already on, and Owen was there, leaning against the counter with a drink in his hand. He looked up at me and smiled. "Couldn't sleep either?" I shook my head, and it was then that I realized just how dry my throat was. He gestured toward the counter and the bottle he poured from. "There's more if you want." I shook my head and then walked over to the fridge for some water. I drank more than I needed to just to give myself something to do, and something that would distract me from him. The air between us felt charged somehow, and I could feel his eyes on me as I drank. When I turned around, he was already standing behind me, and I didn't even realize when he had moved. I jumped when I saw him, and he chuckled. "You can relax, you know. I won't bite." That made me laugh, even if it came out nervous and thin. "I didn't think you would," was all I could say in response. We were standing way too close to each other. I knew that, and yet I didn't pull away. I let him stare at me. It was fine because I was staring at him right back, looking at all his features and observing how he'd changed over the years. It was so quiet between us that I got startled when he finally spoke. He told me that being in the house and being around me was bringing up old memories for him. He continued by telling me that he couldn't stop thinking about how things ended and what our life together had been like before they did. And then suddenly, he said something that made it feel like my heart stopped right in my chest. He got even closer until there was barely any space between us, and he asked, "Did you ever really love me?" The question hit like a punch to the chest. I nearly choked on my water I was still sipping. I had to rush to set it down and then take some deep breaths so I could calm down. Even though I'd heard him perfectly, I asked what he was talking about and why he was asking me that, but he didn't repeat it. He just watched me and waited. I should have walked away. I should have said something sharp and final. But I couldn't. I just let him watch me. I let him practically see into my soul with those intense eyes of his. I didn't want to think about our past, because my life was supposed to be somewhere else now, but my mouth moved before my mind could stop it. "You know I did," I said quietly, "more than anything." The words felt raw on my tongue because they were true. I didn't add that a part of me still did, even after all this time, even after everything that had happened. He didn't touch me at first. He just stood there, close enough for me to smell him. I should have moved back, but I didn't. When his hands came to rest on my waist, I couldn't breathe. His touch was shy, like he was waiting for me to tell him to stop. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't move or push him away. I stayed right where I was, and I let him kiss me. For a second, everything just melted away until it was just us again, like it had been for years. I didn't think about my husband, my marriage, or my son. Instead, I let myself sink into the moment and into the feeling of his lips on mine, and I didn't realize how much I'd missed it until that moment. He pulled back after a while and then just looked at me for a long time. It felt like his eyes were searching mine for something I couldn't say. Then he said quietly, "That's good to know, because I think you're the only woman I'll ever love." Before I could respond, before I could even process what he'd said, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there confused and flustered. After that night in the kitchen, I was a mess. I couldn't think straight. Owen and the kiss were all I could think about. For years I'd gone without thinking about him, but then suddenly he was everywhere. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It had been years. I was so sure I'd fully moved on from him, but it didn't matter how many times I repeated that to myself, because every time I saw him, it felt like I was being pulled back into something I thought I'd outgrown. Even when Benjamin started to soften toward me, I couldn't fully bring myself to care the way I should have. His way of apologizing had always been with gifts, and then words. Something expensive and well thought out to go along with his words. Days after the kiss, when he placed the little black box in my hand and kissed my forehead, I smiled like I was supposed to. It was what I'd been waiting for weeks, and yet I couldn't focus on him. My mind was with Owen. I hated myself for it. I knew what I was risking with all my daydreaming. But desire doesn't really care about logic, I guess, and the way I felt about Owen had long since passed just nostalgia. Days passed like that, with me floating through my own house in a daze, and sometimes I would catch myself watching Owen like he'd watched me in the beginning. I was also in this weird state of denial in those days, because I couldn't bring myself to admit it then. Not in those first few days, at least. Eventually, I did realize that I, somehow, loved both brothers. And truth was, I didn't want to have to choose, even though technically I already had. I wanted both. And the longer I thought about it, the more that want started to feel like something I deserved, even if just for a little while. So one afternoon, when Benjamin was out and the house was quiet, I made my decision. Maybe it was greed. That same selfish streak Benjamin always accused me of having. Or maybe I'd gotten everything I'd wanted for so long, I started to believe that everything was mine to have. But I guess the reason doesn't really matter. It doesn't change what I did. It didn't change the way I walked into Owen's room that day, or the way I took off my shirt. And it certainly didn't change the way I told him that Benjamin could never know. The way I whispered it against his neck as I sat on his lap. That afternoon blurred into something wild and reckless. We didn't talk much. We just let the years between us fade away until we were back to who we used to be. Every touch and every sigh felt like reclaiming something that had been lost. And even before it was over, before I could catch my breath, I knew it wouldn't be the last time. That was how it officially started, and at first it was afternoons. We snuck around when Benjamin was at work and my son was still at school. Owen would wait until the house was quiet, and then he'd come to me. Sometimes it was quick and desperate, like we both knew we were playing with fire. Other times it was slow and almost tender. In those moments, I found it so much harder to pretend like I didn't still feel so much for him. Then it spread into the nights. On the rare evenings when Benjamin worked late, I would slip into the guest room. Sometimes I would even sneak into his room while Benjamin was asleep upstairs. It was reckless and idiotic, I knew that. But I also couldn't bring myself to stop. In my head, I told myself I could have both. I could keep my perfect life and my secret one. I was so sure Owen wouldn't say a word to Benjamin because he loved his brother too much to hurt him. And when I decided I was done reliving my past with Owen, when I'd had enough of the danger and the guilt, I'd just lie to Ben and tell him Owen had been making me uncomfortable. He would be angry, and he would kick his brother out because of it. And our lives would return to normal. Almost like Owen had never shown up in the first place. It was a flawless plan, or at least that's what I thought. But I was very wrong and incredibly naive. One afternoon, a few weeks after it all began, Owen and I were in his room again. He was lying beside me afterward, scrolling through his phone. I didn't pay attention to what he was doing until he reached for me again. By that point, we were having sex almost constantly, and being with him felt too good to think of the consequences. During those moments with him, I couldn't think about anything else. There was no one but him when his hands were on my body. I ignored everything else, including the strange sounds I heard coming from the house while we were having sex. And then, seconds later, I heard those sounds a lot clearer, and I knew instantly that they were footsteps. Before I could really do anything or push Owen off, Benjamin threw open the door. He watched the two of us with a look that slowly moved from confusion to anger. For a few seconds, no one said anything or moved. The room was heavy with a suffocating kind of silence. I quickly pulled away from Owen, and I pulled the sheets around myself. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Benjamin's eyes were on me, then on Owen, and then back to me again. His heavy, ragged breathing told me he was furious. When I finally found my voice, it came out small and shaky. I asked him what he was doing back home. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his phone and then back up at us, at Owen specifically. Owen texted me, he said. His voice was flat and cold. He said our son was sick and that I needed to come home right away. It took a second for his words to make sense, and when they did, I turned toward Owen, who was standing beside the bed, but had at least put on a pair of boxers. He was smiling. Then, with a kind of pride that made me sick, he boasted to Benjamin about how he'd been sleeping with me for weeks, right under his roof, and Ben hadn't even noticed or suspected anything. Benjamin's face went red, and his jaw was clenched so hard it felt I could hear his teeth grinding together. I thought he might hit him in that moment. God, I thought he might even kill him. But Owen wasn't done. He turned to me, grinning like he'd just won something, and the look on his face froze me where I sat, because I can only describe it as giddy. "Did you really think I was going to let you get away with what you did to me?" he said, almost laughing. "You left me for him, and you really thought that I would just let you build this perfect life at my expense?" He looked from me to Benjamin as he spoke, smiling like he was the only one who understood a joke. "I just needed both of you to get comfortable in your little world first, so I could come in and ruin it all like you did for me." He stepped closer to Benjamin, still smirking in this way that made me feel sick. Honestly, it worked out better than I imagined. I thought I'd at least have to work to get her back into my bed, but I didn't have to. She jumped at the chance. Every word hit me like a slap, and my stomach twisted into knots. I turned back to Benjamin, desperate to explain and say something that could undo any of it. I tried to beg him to just tune Owen out and listen to me, but he held up a hand before I could speak. "Don't," he said quietly, looking at me like he didn't even recognize me. And then he just took a step back, shook his head, and told us both to get out. I was hoping he was bluffing and that maybe he just needed time to calm down, but then he started yelling, and I knew there was no calming down for him. And eventually Owen and I found ourselves standing outside almost naked as Benjamin told us never to come near him again. His voice echoed down the street. The neighbors heard. Of course they did. I could see them peeking out from their windows, and a few even standing on their porches. It was humiliating. Benjamin stood in the doorway, when he was done with his rampage, and he glared at me. "You thought you could play me for a fool," he said, "but you'll both find out soon enough who the real fools are." Then he slammed the door in our faces. I don't even remember where Owen went or if I said anything to him. All I remember was waiting and begging on the porch. I remember the way I banged on the door and begged him to just listen to me. It all fell on deaf ears, though. Benjamin didn't answer, and eventually the shame got too much to bear. So I left. I wrapped those sheets right around me, got in my car, and just drove until I got to my brother's places. For a couple of days, I didn't hear from him. I thought maybe he'd cool off, and that we could talk it through somehow, maybe even fix things. But I underestimated just how much Benjamin was capable of. And eventually the consequences started to come in. It began with the whispers. People knew, everyone knew really. My so-called friends, the wives I used to try so hard to impress, stopped answering my calls and texts. No one wanted to be seen with me or caught talking to me, not after what I'd done. I became a scandal in the neighborhood, a pariah no one wanted to have any connection with. Then came the bank notifications. All my transactions kept declining, as well as my cards. Everything was frozen and inaccessible. When I called the bank, they told me Benjamin had shut down all our joint accounts and restricted me from all of his, which meant that I had nothing. I hadn't worked in years. I had no money of my own, no savings. There was nothing. I tried reaching out to him through calls and messages, even emails, but he didn't respond. Until one afternoon, while I was staying at my brother's house, I heard a knock on the door. It was a man in a suit. He handed me an envelope with my name printed neatly across it, and I knew before opening it what it was, but I opened it anyway. They were divorce papers, document after document detailing the end of our marriage and filled with blank spaces for me to sign. And worse, Benjamin was filing for sole custody. I remember sitting on the couch with the papers spread across my lap and feeling something inside me break. I knew that I had lost him. Those papers made me finally realize that there might not be a way to come back from it all. But that wasn't even the end of it. Just a day after the papers were served, I got a message from Ben. And for a second, I thought maybe he wanted to talk, and maybe there was still a chance to fix things, or at least make peace. But when I opened the message, my heart dropped. It wasn't a text. It was a document, and in it was every piece of evidence from the credit card I'd opened in his name. All the transactions and the dates. He didn't say anything else, but I knew what he was threatening me with, and I knew that I was in big trouble because lawyers didn't stand a chance against Benjamin's. The days blurred after that. Meetings with lawyers, tears that wouldn't stop, and this sick feeling that all of it was just beginning. Every time I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Now I don't know what comes next. I've lost everything. My friends, my marriage, my home. I might even lose my son. And if Benjamin follows through on his threat, I could lose my freedom too.